In 1983, a team of deeply curious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a man without any access to his senses, or any ways to perceive stimuli, would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human would be able to establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind, in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but none were convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives. He repeated personal information about the scientists that only their dead spouses or parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists had left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed. He said the voices were overwhelming him. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices, all refusing to leave him alone. He threw himself against the wall repeatedly, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile. They were speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to contacting God. After another day, the subject could no longer form sentences. He went seemingly mad and started biting off chunks of his own flesh. The scientists rushed in and restrained him so he would not be able to kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared at the ceiling as teardrops streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, he made eye contact with a scientist. For the first time in the study, he whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." His vital signs soon stopped, and there was no apparent cause to his death.